Now, good evening. This is Robert Bell, and you're watching Getting the Record Straight. Welcome. When you watch this, please take a second to subscribe to this channel, share it, share the episode, like it. By the way, this is the Truth to Power episode that we do. I haven't really done too much with music lately or entertainment, but I will. I have someone scheduled actually for the end of the week. As I said, subscribe, share, like, and most importantly, stay safe right now. Still not out of the woods. I just got back from Chicago yesterday and seeing my grandchildren. That was a wonderful thing. But, you know, even on the plane, they had us separated and mask on and all that stuff. So please continue to, you know, follow or adhere to some precautions. With me this evening is Mr. Linn Washington Jr. Linn is a great journalist. We were just kind of chatting before we started recording, trying to figure out how we knew each other and when, and we didn't come to an agreement on that. I guess at our age, we've just forgotten too much and just can't remember. But Linn is a tremendous journalist in the city and well-known nationally for that matter. He's a professor of journalism at Temple, specializing in investigative news coverage and analytical commentary. He tends to focus on race-based inequities in the criminal justice system and the news media, as well as social justice. He's risen from being a general assignment worker for the newspaper to an executive editor. He's been a special assistant to Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, co-founded an organization called PhiladelphiaNeighborhoods.com. And he also writes for Counterpunch and a website called This Can't Be Happening. And that's where I catch a lot of the things that he writes. He's written more recently. He's a graduate of both Temple University undergrad and Yale University grad school. And so without further ado, let me welcome and introduce Linn Washington. How you doing this evening?
I'm doing well. Thanks for the invitation.
It's my pleasure.
Being here with.
Couldn't wait to get you on, man. I've followed you for years and always uplifted and enlightened by your analysis and depth that you go into when you're on top of something. Just can you expound just on a couple of things
Sure.
that I was looking at in your bio? What was it? Well, one was, who was the Chief Justice that you were?
So that was Chief Justice Robert N.C. Nix Jr.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he was the first African-American to become a Chief Justice of a Supreme Court in the United States. And he served on the court from 72 to sometime in the 90s when he was mid 70 years old and they had mandatory retirement. So really a fascinating experience. Getting behind the veil. You know, as a reporter, you're always out on the outside. You wonder what's going on behind the veil. So I got a chance to see that. And it's like the proverbial sausage factory. When you see what's going on in the sausage factory, you may want to like back off or have some sausages or something, or a hot dog or something. Yeah, justice in too many instances is just a word that's too rarely applied to Black folk.
And the second thing I wanted you just to clarify is your journalist experience. What newspapers have you written for? And you know.
Whoa, let's see. Well, in Philadelphia, I started off at the Philadelphia Tribune. I started working there as a full-time reporter in the fall of 1975. But for about 2 years before that, I was writing a entertainment column for them called Checking It Out. And you know how you try to find a way to get in. I found a niche in that I went out and did the community-based entertainment.
Mm,
It was people who wanted to do the big venue events, the Bijou at the time that doesn't exist anymore, the Spectrum at the time that doesn't exist anymore. But I would go to church basements, I would go to recreation centers and doing the community stuff. And then a position opened up on the news side. Didn't really want to do news because ironically, I went to school to be a TV news director. And I wanted to actually go out and cover news, you know, cover wars and all that kind of stuff. That didn't happen. So an opportunity opened up with newspapers. I never knew any newspaper reporters growing up. The only newspaper reporter I knew was Clark Kent, and he was just a newspaper reporter incidental to being Superman. But then I found that I really liked it. It just melded all of the things I had an interest in. And it also gave me a platform to explore, report on, and expose, you know, issues of racism and social injustice that affect our people.
So was the Tribune anything else in Philly?
Well, the Tribune, then I went to a paper called the Philadelphia Journal, which doesn't exist anymore. Right. Then I went with the Philadelphia Daily News. I was there for 10 years. While I was at the Daily News, I did some writing for the Inquirer, mainly for the Inquirer magazine. And towards the end of my time at the Daily News, I started writing more nationally with the Pacific News Service out of San Francisco and then different news services around the country. I went from the Daily News to the Supreme Court. I worked there for a couple of years, came back to the Tribune as an editor, stayed there for 2 years, about 2.5 years, then went to the Philadelphia New Observer as an editor. And then I was picked up at Temple University as a professor. And then the Tribune invited me back to be a columnist. So I was a columnist for them for like 17 years. And that was like unheard of to be in any one place, particularly in the news business, 17 years. So I've had a diversity of publications. I mean, really, literally from Philly to Paris. Yeah. I used to do some stuff for some African-based news services out of Paris too. So.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of get, let people know in case they didn't, just how extensive your career is and where you spent some of your time. But in terms of just issues and things you've been looking at and focusing on and kind of trying to get your head around, because it's so much going on. Let's talk nationally right now. There's obviously, a couple of weeks in the election, whole lot of controversy on so many levels. Just what's your, I guess, general outlook on how that's, how that's being played out?
I don't know if my outlook is fashioned around what I hope to happen or some forethought of what possibly could happen. This is really scary times. We have America really exposing itself. I mean, I don't want to get too profane, but the America that Black people have known has always been different from the America that it projects itself. Land of the free and home of the brave. Well, that never applied to us in a real sense. And I'm not just talking about enslavement, because the reality is that during that period of slavery, all Black people were not slaves. There were many who either escaped from slavery, purchased their freedom. Some were born free. Some were never slaves when they came over. However, those people were also treated less than fairly and less than first-class citizens. They wouldn't allow them to vote. They could own land and pay property taxes, which was the requirement, but they wouldn't allow them to vote. Now, we think of lack of voting as something that happens in the South. No. In Pennsylvania, they took away the right to vote for Black people, first in a Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruling around 1832, and then in the following year, the legislature took away that right too. Similar sort of judicial and legislative action happened in New Jersey. So this effort to keep Blacks from voting, this effort to keep Blacks separate and apart. I mean, a real apartheid has been a part of America's history from its very inception.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've been looking at issues of voting rights, looking at issues of abusive policing. We look at abusive policing pretty much as a recent phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
It has not been a recent phenomenon. Again, it has been something that evolved out of the slave patrols that made sure that persons who wanted to try to regain their freedom were brought back to that enslavement. There was for example, there was a race riot in Philadelphia in 1918, literally a few months before the Spanish flu pandemic hit
Mm-hmm.
the city and wiped out a whole lot of folks. Interestingly enough, proportionately, not that many Black folks,
Mm-hmm.
because the hospitals at the time were segregated.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that segregation, white people were flocking to the hospitals, and the hospitals became spreader
Mm-hmm.
locations.
Mm-hmm.
So Black people shied away from going to those segregated hospitals. It kind of kept the death rate in Black neighborhoods down somewhat. But during this race riot, where police actively aided and abetted the racists in attacking Blacks, a new organization sprang up, the Colored Protective Association.
Mm-hmm.
It sprang up specifically to deal with police brutality. And they did so because at the time, the city's NAACP chapter and the Urban League were not aggressive enough in addressing police brutality. So this is an issue that we've been rumbling with for decades. You know, and that's something that, you know, I covered: housing, you know, individual discrimination, you know, all sorts of issues, part of the career, yeah.
Well, getting back to the election coming up, have you had a chance to look at the plans? There's a platinum plan that supposedly is being pushed by Trump, and Biden has a plan. Have you had a chance to review either of them? And
I've reviewed them in only a cursory sort of way. Biden's is more substantial, and it also has more of a likelihood of actually being implemented. Trump is just throwing anything against the wall. This is a guy for 3.5 years who has shown his total and utter racist contempt for Black people, yet he has the shameless gall to put out a platinum plan. This is what I'm going to do for you. You know, come on, you know, Black people, what do you got to lose? Well, he said that in 2016, and now we see. So let me just give you just two, I think, very salient examples. In September of this year, Trump was at a town hall meeting at the Constitution Center, which is downtown in Philly, on Independence Mall. He said he doesn't think there's racism in the country. He's not really sure, but he's pretty certain that it doesn't exist. A lie. He also said that if it does exist, it certainly doesn't exist in him. A big lie. But here's a guy that literally days before making those pronouncements, telling those lies, his administration eliminated anti-racism training in the federal government. There was efforts to try to educate people and mitigate some of the racism that Black people and other persons of color experience. And white supremacist Trump said that that was anti-American propaganda. So if he was really so much for Black people, why is it that he is doing what he can to undo moderate efforts to try to reverse the racism that we encounter? And even worse, Mr. Businessman, the representative of the Republican Party, the supposed party of business, earlier this year, in mid-March, late March, the federal government, the Trump administration, initiated waivers on all contracts for services, goods, and construction related to fighting the COVID pandemic. So they eliminated the affirmative action requirements, which in effect built a wall around the ability of Black businesses to tap into any of that billions of dollars that the federal government is doing. That's just two things that he did in 2020. Yet he's the guy that's going to initiate a platinum plan. I don't think so. And I'm sure there's people out there that'll buy that, but they're buying an empty bag of dry excrement.
Well, going forward, let's say that the stars align properly. I actually have a prediction I haven't made public, but I would not be surprised if Trump does not make it literally. I mean, in terms of living past the election. Only because if indeed he has this COVID or had it, and I happen to work for the Department of Public Health, and you can hide and mask it, and maybe get hopped up on something to get you around for a while, but that's nothing to play with. And he may be toying with something that may end up having, a really serious effect on him. But that said, I don't feel that, things end in terms of the maladies, the problems, the issues that we face as African Americans here after November 3rd. That like I said, if the stars align and Biden and Harris do win, there's still a lot of work to be done. And just wanted to get your sense of that, especially on the criminal justice side. What work has to be done in those areas that you see?
Well, you're correct in that the election of Biden-Harris is not going to magically eliminate all of the impediments that have been built up over centuries. The reality is, this is pragmatic politics. You have a better chance of addressing these grave and life-threatening maladies with a Biden-Harris versus a Trump-Pence. Now, in terms of addressing these things, yes, go vote on November 3rd, and depending on your feelings about being at the polls in person, put that mail-in ballot, but take it to an election, not one of these drop boxes. No. Take it to an election office. Okay. We have these satellite offices in Philadelphia. Today, in fact, we rode up to Wilmington. I live down in Delaware. And my wife took hers right into the actual office building and dropped it off. I plan to be in line. Right. I have my little cane with a chair on it. I don't need a cane, but I might need a chair if it's long. And listen, if I have to stay in line for hours, I'm gonna wear Depends. I'm a voting person. Now, but in terms of addressing these problems, they're multifaceted. The criminal justice system needs more change than some reforms with police procedure. Oh, well, you can't choke anybody. Okay, fine. Well, the reality is that the largest category of police abuse or abusive policing, however you want to frame it, fortunately, it's not fatal shootings or beatings. It's false arrests. So how are you going to address that? The system acknowledges that about 10% of the people who are imprisoned are totally innocent. So you can say, but that's just 10%, things happen, and the system always corrects itself. No, it doesn't. But just step back for a minute. If we have 2 million people in the United States incarcerated, in prison, 10% is what? 200,000. We have 200,000 people existing in the hellscapes of prisons. So we have to do something about that. We have to do something about the judging and the quality of judges. Right now, there's this big sham going on down on Capitol Hill to confirm this Supreme Court nominee. The code of ethics would seemingly indicate that that judge could say, look, yes, I'm going on the Supreme Court, but because of the provisions of code of conduct for judges, it would be and is inappropriate for me to say, take a vote on a matter that involves a challenge by the Trump administration to the election results. She knows good and well she's being put on that court to do the bidding of Donald Trump. So this is a person who has no honor, absolutely. The Republicans who are ramming this thing through have no honor, absolutely. When we look at the judiciary, for example, Trump has put 54 people on the federal appeals court bench, and the federal appeals courts are the second highest courts in the United States in the federal system. Of that 54, would you care to hazard a guess how many are Black?
I put my money on 0.
And you would be correct. You know, you got it. None. Yet here's a guy who said he's the best friend that Black people ever had, with the possible exception of Abraham Lincoln. So there's a lot of issues that need to be addressed and addressed in a substantive way. And it's going to require activism that persists beyond Election Day in November, beyond an inauguration. And if it means that Black people, either themselves or in some sort of alliance with Latinos and others, the progressive whites, that they have to, take action, step to a Biden-Harris administration, and that's what's going to be required. And when we look at massive levels of impoverishment, like we have in Philadelphia has the highest level of poverty of the large cities in America. A quarter of the people in Philadelphia live below the poverty line. The poverty line is what, a family of 4 making $24,000 a year?
I'm not sure.
Something like that. And then there's a separate category of people who are living in deep poverty. You have to do something about that. A lot of this poverty is generational. And when you break the statistics out in terms of demographics, many of those people who are impoverished are children. So they're growing up in supposedly the richest country on earth, barely having enough food to eat at night. Now that people are being educated remotely, they have their Chromebooks or whatever the school district was giving out, but they don't have internet access. And because of COVID, they can't go into a library and get on free Wi-Fi. So there's a lot of issues, and they have to be addressed, I think, in many ways simultaneously. And the roadmaps for doing this, we don't have to have a Black convention or anything. When we look back over the years, we've had all kinds of blueprints, from the Niagara movement of Du Bois in 1904, Marcus Garvey's organization in 1920, and we can just go forward. If we pull those documents together, and when you look at them, they all have similar themes. Get rid of racism in the criminal justice system, have some economic equity, not equality of result, but equality of opportunity. Don't slam the door in my face and then say, well, if you can come inside, maybe we'll let you try to work your way up to the top. Well, you won't. I can't get inside if you got the door slammed and barricaded. So, the short answer, Rob, is that there's a lot that needs to be done, and we can't take our foot off the pedal. These last couple of months with this resurgence of social activism around Black Lives Matter, that has to continue. This is a rare and unique opportunity, and we have to keep it going. But now we have the energy of the youth. Heaven knows that persons who are middle-aged and seniors are totally perturbed with it. So we can all come together and try to, move forward. And when I say come together, I'm not having some mythical unity in the Black community. You're never going to get everybody down on everything.
Yeah.
If you get enough people moving in a direction, then you can get some change happening. And that has been the history. Everybody, despite what they're claiming now, everybody wasn't down with the civil rights movement.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Not with King either. And it's about getting a critical mass, I think, of folks who want to do something and can do something and are educated on the issue, so they have a really good sense of what needs to be done. And even if that, like you said, means looking at past examples and former plans and that kind of thing and just updating them, it needs to happen. Real quickly, though, you mentioned that you do some work with some African news services in France. Any comments on or perspective on, kind of the international scene and how we as Blacks fit into it, and as opposed to how the country is approaching things? I just saw a piece on the news concerning Bolivia, which for people who are still concerned, concerned with freedom and independence and that kind of thing, was something positive to hear. But so many of us, I feel nowadays, are just really ignorant of issues internationally.
Yeah.
But they do relate to what we're doing here. And as you said, if you look back over history in terms of those who were, struggling for civil rights and human rights, there always was a kind of linkage and an understanding of our struggle being part of a larger global and human struggle.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
I think some of that internationalist perspective that has always been embedded in the Black experience in the United States has dissipated over the last 30 or 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
My thinking is a large part of that, well, some part of it, because Malcolm X once said that the Negroes' worst problem in America is that they're American,
Mm-hmm.
themselves as American.
Mm-hmm.
But I think when we move from that nascent awareness of being Black to being African American, we kind of like stop looking overseas.
Mm.
When you look at France, for example, which you brought up, there's a lot of Black people in France, there's a lot of people of color in France, and their experience is hauntingly similar to what happens to Black people in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
They have a horrific problem with police brutality over there.
Mm.
We didn't get, it happened, but we didn't get too much coverage on it in white media or Black media here. But in 2005, there was an incident of abusive policing. 2 young men were electrocuted, and it created riots all across France.
Mm.
When we look at England, for example, America's great ally, their experience is just incredibly similar. We here in America extol the Black Panthers, and rightfully so. Well, there was Black Panthers in England. We didn't even know that. We think England is just soccer hooligan and fish and chips. But there's native-born Black Brits. There's the Black Brits that trace their ancestry to the Caribbean. And then there's African Black Brits from East and West Africa, from the former colonies there. And again, police brutality, a very common problem. In 2011, there was a shooting in North London, fatal shooting of a guy named Mark Duggan. And that lit off riots all across the country. The news media and the government over there at the time said, oh, these are people just greedy. They want to get sneakers, which they call trainers over there. And they want to get flat screen TVs. But when people started going in and doing some reporting and doing some actual reports based on the what people are saying, they were saying that a big problem of what started that was a police practice called stop and search. In America, we call it stop and frisk. Mm-hmm. So there's those things there that we just overlook. In some ways, we just don't know because we don't get that perspective and that much of an introduction. Same way on the African continent, man. We're West Africa, Southern Africa. There's connections that could be made that are not made and amplified enough. And part of the problem is on both sides of the Atlantic. We have perspectives and somewhat disdain for Africans, and reality speaking, they have the same for us. And it's wrong. Mm-hmm. We need to overcome that. And if we do, we could have much more unity. There are more Black people in Brazil
Mhm.
in South America than any other country outside of Nigeria in terms of being one country.
Mhm.
There are more Black people in Brazil than there are in the United States. Do we know that? Black people in
Right.
Cuba, we know about the Caribbean, but there's Black people in Colombia, for goodness sakes, on the West Coast, not on the East Coast, but on the West Coast,
Mhm.
Nicaragua. So
Yeah.
there's Black people all around, but, we don't identify with that. And I know this may be, taking a little detour here, but this notion of African American, if we play that out as literal as it is,
Mhm.
a former member of the apartheid government or the apartheid system in South Africa can come over here and say, I'm an African American,
Mhm.
because they were born in Africa.
Yeah. Mhm.
So, but this internationalist strain has been buried in our community, and we need to resurrect it and really embrace it. I
Sure.
think back to the founding of the first Black newspaper in the country, Freedom's Journal, in 1827. And they had I think in their second edition, they laid out a manifesto in terms of what they wanted to do. And what has come down through history is that we wish to tell our own story for too long. Others have told it and, told it improperly. But they also said that all things about Africa will find ready admission in the pages of our paper. So even in those days, there was that recognition of our Africanness and our connection to the African continent. And you can imagine what was going on back in them days, man, 1820, 27.
And where was that? Where was the first newspaper?
It was in New York City.
Oh,
And
okay.
they founded it in part because the newspapers in New York City were so abjectly racist
Mhm.
and so vehemently pro-slavery. Just getting, delving into the media a little bit, the first organized criticism about racism in the media occurred here in Philadelphia.
Mhm.
1794, there was a yellow fever epidemic in the city in 1793, wiped out 10% of the population. At the time, the thinking was, since Black people were from Africa, they were immune to yellow fever because they had been bitten by mosquitoes enough. They had an immunity to it. Not true. And the Black people at the time said, okay, well, if we can prove our worth to white people by staying in the city and nursing the sick and burying the dead and, taking care of services, because the well-to-do whites fled.
Mhm.
They went to, say, Germantown. That's where George Washington went. He was living here in the city as the president. And when that yellow fever epidemic hit, he got out of the city,
Mhm.
miles away from the city, because at that point, Germantown was a separate city. People were going out to what is now Belmont Plateau, because the city was just City Hall down to the Delaware River, basically from Ray Street down to Lombard South Street area. That was the city. And
Mhm.
those what settlements were in South Philly were outside of the city. So there was a white guy named Matthew Carey. He comes back after he fled the city, writes this pamphlet saying that Blacks were criminals. They were stealing money from white people and treating them bad and blah, blah, blah. Just a bunch of lies, very similar to today. And Richard Allen, the founder of the AME Church, and Absalom Jones, two Black leaders at the time, wrote an extensive rebuttal to Matthew Carey. And it was one of the first things ever published by Black people, but it was also one of the first things, the first effort to assail racism in the media. Downtown at 4th and Market Street, there is a plaque honoring Matthew Carey. He had a publishing house here. And that plaque is right outside the building of Fox 29. So I don't know if that says anything about Fox in their news coverage and their
Absolutely.
coverage, but it's just an interesting coincidence.
Well, that's a good segue, though, into the last thing I wanted you to comment on is kind of what's going on in the city. You mentioned and cited Philadelphia as having the largest population, impoverished population. of the major cities. And I'm just wondering, I mean, you certainly don't see anything publicly. You might, if you dig around, a plan for how to deal with the poverty, but it's certainly nothing that's highly publicized. And I don't remember getting any call or email or pamphlet saying, come to a community meeting because we're putting a plan together and we'd like your input. So what are we doing wrong? And in particular, this criminal justice thing is certainly an issue here in Philly. What is it? The head of the FOP is now suing. I guess he's suing the city, is it?
There's multiple suits. Yeah, they're suing the city. They're criticizing some actions. There's been an officer that was charged with murder, and they're going to support him 100%. They're denying that that the Proud Boys have any connection with them, although the Proud Boys hang out at the FOP Union Hall in the far Northeast. Again, there's multiple issues on many different levels. Economic equity. We're basically shut out. If you don't get those like set-asides or whatever, it's just hard to get contracts and business opportunities. We see the problems with the educational system. One of the reasons why I think there's these problems is because people don't stay on it. When I mean people, I mean the elected officials, members of city council, and also the civic and religious communities. They don't stay on it enough to force the change that needs to happen. And look at housing. There was this encampment of the homeless people on the Parkway all summer, and then they took over some land up in North Philly and did it. Both of those encampments were ended with an agreement that the city would turn over 50 vacant houses, or 60 or 100, and then the unions would come in and fix them up, and now we can house 100 people. Okay, great, that's good. 100 people now have houses. But there's 10 to 20,000 people on the waiting list to get into public housing now. That's not going to do much. But that effort to take abandoned houses and turn them into occupied houses was something that was done in the late 70s and early 80s by Milton Street, Henry DiBernardo, the late Charlie Boo Burris. So those efforts could have been made, but they weren't sustained. And that's part of the problem. I mean, we've had, look how many Black heads of the school district we've had, and we still can't get adequate education in neighborhood schools. Great education in the charter schools, the elite schools are still doing well, but why is it that the city schools are not doing well? It's really tragic what has and hasn't happened. But part of what hasn't happened is that we don't get sustained commitment to make sure that change occurs. I mentioned a few minutes back about the U.S. Constitution Center, and when Donald Trump used that to spew more lies at a town hall a couple of weeks ago. Well, when that building was being built about 12 years ago, they excluded Blacks from construction jobs there. And there was an exclusion of Black architects and Black construction firms. Now, people protested that, but here's my point. You had a lot of people out there protesting to get people jobs, and you had the boys in the hood standing on the corners with 40s, watching these protests going on instead of putting the 40 down and walking across the street and taking part in trying to get economic opportunities opened up for them. If we're not going to fight for ourselves, ain't nobody else going to fight for us. And when you look back and when you talk to some white people, they'll admit, they said, we don't understand why you people take this stuff. We just wonder when you're going to rise up and do something. And many people in our community are wondering the same thing. When are we going to rise up on a sustained basis and keep this thing going?
In my mind, a lot of it has to do with you know, that adage that you've heard, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And
Yeah.
that's why I kind of made that reference a little earlier, like, where is it? You know, and I don't know why. It just seems like low-hanging fruit. Even if your plan doesn't work,
Right.
that's one thing. But what you're all sitting downtown there, why isn't there a group of you getting together and putting together a plan? I mean, there's so many things that need to be addressed, and they need to be addressed in a systematic way, and, you know, with timelines and all of that kind of stuff. And like I said, even if they don't work out, at least you can look at it and say, well, here's where we need to improve. Here's where we need to get better. Here's where we need more resources. But instead of this haphazard shoot from the hip, whatever's going on, everything is reactionary, you know?
Right. Well, from my understanding, City Council is now trying to fashion a comprehensive way to get at attacking this deep impoverishment in the city. There's some council persons that are fashioning some legislation to try to crack these economic inequities. So there seems to be more initiative to do these things, and hopefully the inertia will come from that, and then that would really start propelling things forward. Because you know, despite the gentrification that's going on in the city, you're not going to push 500,000 people out of the city. It's just not going to happen. So something has to happen to help the folks that are here, and it's only well deserved. I mean, we have this this property tax abatement that if you build new construction or substantial renovation, you get a 10-year tax break. But here's somebody who's living on the same block. The house may be multi-generational in that a grandparent bought it, the parents had it, now the children have it. They're low income or no income. A gentrifier comes on the block, puts up a new house, $450,000, $650,000. The property taxes for that whole block now go up. But this person who caused those property taxes to go up has a 10-year tax abatement. So the people who've been living there forever, with their taxes going up, they might be have to force to sell because they just can't pay the taxes on the house that they already own. So these sort of policies and practices, there needs to be a broad review of them and make sure that things are being done equitably. There's a tax in the city that they hardly ever collect. And it's a tax that is put on trust and stock sales and things like that. And that money is specifically earmarked for the school district. Now, if the Philadelphia Stock Exchange does $1 billion or more in sales per year, and that particular tax only yields a couple of $100,000, something's wrong.
Yeah.
You know, because a couple of $100,000 on $1 billion plus, you're talking about a collection rate of way less than 0.5 of 1%. So there are things that can be done that are not being done.
Well, any parting words for us, parting wisdom?
Yeah, I would just like to emphasize the fact that we are at a very unique place in history. And if we continue with this renewed activism and attention to social equity and social justice, I think things will change around. It's not going to be easy, but the reality is when you read all of the quote unquote good books, be it the Bible, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, if you're into Hinduism, or with all of them, they all say that life will be bountiful, but not one of them ever says it's going to be easy. So we got to be ready to rumble, but we've always rumbled. That's why we're here, and they haven't killed us all off. So yeah, let's take advantage of this moment, move forward, learn from the wisdoms of the Martins and the Malcolms, be sustained from the energies of like the Marvin Gayes and our artists, and we'll get through this.
All right.
Yeah.
Hey, Linn, thanks so much. Keep up the great work, man.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Okay.
Now.
Take care, Brian.